Comment on the video, where are people watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. After a long and demanding day at work, Bart Higgins, a dedicated software engineer with a reputation for solving even the most complex coding puzzles, finally returned to his suburban home, eager for a moment of relaxation. The late afternoon light had gradually faded into a calm twilight, and Bart envisioned nothing more than a quiet respite by his pool, a private haven he had painstakingly maintained over the years. The gentle hum of the neighborhood and the soft chirping of crickets in the background had always provided the perfect backdrop to unwind after a stressful day. As Bart stepped through the front door, the usual comfort of his home was palpable. He left his briefcase in the hallway and made his way to the backyard, where the crystalline water of his pool sparkled under the remaining light. The pool, with its inviting blue surface and the meticulous landscaping that framed it, was his sanctuary, a place where he could finally let his thoughts drift away from the challenges of the day. However, upon approaching the pool area, Bart was abruptly taken aback by an unexpected sight. There, in his own backyard, stood a woman accompanied by her young son. The woman, known as Mrs. Eleanor Featherbottom, appeared unfazed by the fact that she was in Bart's private domain, while her son splashed carelessly in the water. For Bart, the realization that his personal retreat was being used without permission stirred a blend of surprise, annoyance, and a deep sense of violation. Every element of this unexpected scene felt like an intrusion. His carefully curated space was no longer solely his. Bart's mind raced as he tried to reconcile the serene vision he had of his pool with the reality before him. The sight of Mrs. Featherbottom and her son disrupted not only his plan for relaxation but also the unspoken rules of neighborhood etiquette that most respected personal boundaries. His thoughts churned with questions: who had given them permission to use the pool? Why would they assume it was acceptable to be on his property without even a word of consent? The more he pondered, the greater his dismay grew. Standing there at the threshold of a space that had always symbolized safety and tranquility, Bart felt an immediate urge to reclaim control. His initial shock was quickly transforming into a determined resolve to confront the situation head-on. The pool, which for him represented hard-earned peace and privacy, now stood as a symbol of an unexpected breach that could not be ignored. Despite the late hour and the stillness that usually governed his evenings, the audacity of the scene before him demanded an immediate response. In that critical moment, as the cool night air began to settle in and the sound of distant traffic melded with the whispering trees, Bart Higgins braced himself for the confrontation that was sure to follow. Unbeknownst to him, this initial, uninvited intrusion into his sanctuary would mark the beginning of a series of events that would soon challenge the very fabric of neighborhood trust and personal rights. Bart Higgins, still reeling from the shock of stumbling upon an uninvited presence in his backyard, gathered himself quickly. Determined not to let the intrusion pass without question, he strode toward the pool area. There, he found Mrs. Eleanor Featherbottom standing casually with her young son, who was enjoying an impromptu swim. The clear blue water of Bart's meticulously maintained pool now reflected an awkward scene of disregard for property boundaries. With a firm tone, Bart called out to Mrs. Featherbottom, his words measured but filled with a growing sense of indignation. "Excuse me, but this is my pool," he stated. His voice carried the authority of a homeowner protecting his sanctuary, and he made it clear that the unannounced use of his private space was unacceptable. Mrs. Featherbottom, however, appeared unruffled by Bart's arrival. With a dismissive wave of her hand and an air of nonchalance, she quickly explained that her son had merely jumped in to cool off. "There's no harm done, Bart," she said lightly, as though the pool were a communal amenity provided for everyone's benefit. Bart's mind raced. His pool was his personal retreat, painstakingly maintained as a peaceful haven after long days of work, and now it had been casually overrun. The tension between them thickened rapidly. Bart found himself struggling to balance his frustration with his desire for a calm resolution. He explained that he had not given permission for anyone to use his pool, and that his property rights were being ignored. His earnest appeal, however, was met with further dismissals from Mrs. Featherbottom. Her tone, at times condescending, suggested that her perspective on courtesy and neighborhood courtesy was vastly different from his own. As Bart's words echoed in the cool evening air, his heart pounded with both anger and disbelief. This was not simply a misunderstanding, it was an overt challenge to his right to enjoy the fruits of his labor in peace. The familiar comforts of his carefully arranged outdoor space, the flowering shrubs, the gentle glow of the garden lights, and the soft ripple of water, were suddenly overshadowed by the intrusion of someone who seemed to have little regard for neighborly respect. In that heated moment, Bart resolved that he would not allow the breach of his personal space to go unanswered. He reiterated his demand that both Mrs. Featherbottom and her son vacate his property immediately. To Bart, this was not a question of minor inconvenience but of asserting boundaries that every homeowner deserved. The pool, with its shimmering surface and quiet promise of tranquility, had been transformed in an instant into a contested space. And as the conversation spiraled into a standoff, Bart braced himself, knowing that this confrontation might only be the first move in a sequence of unexpected events. The standoff between Bart Higgins and Mrs. Eleanor Featherbottom grew more charged as their voices mingled with the ambient sounds of the cooling night. Despite Bart's insistence that his pool was private property and that his request for his guests to leave was reasonable, Mrs. Featherbottom's dismissal of his concerns took on an unsettling edge. What began as a simple demand for respect now teetered toward an escalation that neither of them had likely foreseen. Frustration and disbelief twisted inside Bart as he repeated his request, only to be met with a shrug and a feigned indifference from Mrs. Featherbottom. In an unexpected turn, she reached for her cell phone. Within moments, the clicking of keys and the murmur of a conversation filled the tense silence between them. Bart's brow furrowed with worry as he realized what was unfolding. Mrs. Featherbottom was dialing 911. Moments later, a hushed but deliberate voice came through the phone line from the other end, as Mrs. Featherbottom reported the incident. In her account, she painted Bart as the aggressor, a man resorting to force with a hint of racial overtones when his pool was invaded by her innocent son. Bart's heart pounded as the surreal nature of the situation sank in. He knew he was not the aggressor, rather, he was merely a homeowner demanding respect for his property. The accusations rang false in his ears, yet they had already set in motion a chain of events that would disrupt the peaceful evening. Bart tried to interject, to correct the false portrayal of his behavior, but the damage was done. Each word from the other end of the line reaffirmed the picture being painted by Mrs. Featherbottom, one in which he was the instigator. In a mix of disbelief and rising anger, Bart realized that his efforts to de-escalate the situation were being undermined by a misrepresentation of facts. The sense of injustice welled inside him as he recalled every detail of the encounter, the clear blue pool, the muffled splashing of a boy, and the cool but firm voice of his protest. As minutes passed, Bart's pulse raced, and the night's tranquility dissolved into a bizarre state of conflict. His attempts to explain the matter were rendered ineffective by the damaging account that had now been relayed. Mrs. Featherbottom's version of events had already taken root in the mind of the emergency responders. For Bart, the situation felt not only personally violating but deeply absurd, a stark reminder that sometimes even the simplest encounters can spiral into unforeseen complications. Left with little choice, Bart stood silently by his pool, his expression a blend of hurt and incredulity, as the repercussions of the 911 call began to echo in the night. He now braced himself for what would follow, knowing that the next act in this unfolding drama was likely to bring even more unexpected challenges. No sooner had the false 911 call been placed than a piercing wail of sirens cut through the night's uneasy quiet. Bart Higgins, still reeling from the mischaracterization of his behavior, watched as the flashing lights of police vehicles approached his property. His hope was that these officials would swiftly restore order and set the record straight. However, nothing could have prepared him for the shocking turn the evening would now take. As the police vehicles came to a stop at the edge of his driveway, two men emerged from one of the cars. Their uniforms looked standard at first glance, but soon something about their demeanor and appearance set off alarm bells in Bart's mind. One of the officers stepped forward aggressively, his gaze sweeping over the pool area before locking onto Bart with an intensity that betrayed an air of hostility rather than protection. "Sir, you need to come with us," the man ordered in a tone that was both cold and unyielding. Bart's instincts screamed that something was amiss. He tried to explain that he had merely asked his unexpected visitors to leave his private property, yet the officer's expression remained unreadable. The artificial politeness in his uniform contrasted starkly with his words, leaving Bart with an uneasy feeling that these were not ordinary officers. Before Bart could press further, the other man joined in, corroborating the demand with equally forceful language. Their actions were synchronized in a manner that suggested they were following a script rather than conducting a genuine investigation. Bart's heart thumped in his chest as the men began to surround him, their presence growing more menacing by the second. There was a chilling undertone to their movements, a precision and an urgency that did not align with the standard protocols of law enforcement he knew. As the fake officers advanced, Bart noticed subtle details that raised doubts about their authenticity. Their badges, hanging from their uniforms, seemed unusually worn and poorly made. The shine that one might expect from a well-maintained badge was missing, replaced instead with a dull, almost plastic-like appearance. But in the moment, words failed Bart, he felt only a rising tide of anxiety and indignation. Despite his protests and insistence that he had done nothing wrong, the impostors refused to listen. One of them even threatened arrest, his tone laced with an unwarranted menace. "You are trespassing on your own property if you refuse to comply," he spat, a statement that made little sense yet left no room for objection. It was as if the officers had been sent not to protect but to execute a hidden agenda, a dark directive originating not from any law but from the fabrications of Mrs. Featherbottom's complaint. Bart's mind raced as he tried to process the scene unfolding before him. The surreal nature of what was happening made his palms sweat and his voice tremble. How could real police act in such a manner? He recalled the earlier conversation with Mrs. Featherbottom, the false allegations that had now spiraled into a full-blown invasion of his privacy by men who were meant to enforce the law. His pool, once a symbol of personal solace, was now the stage for a dramatic and bizarre confrontation. Determined to maintain his dignity and assert his rights, Bart attempted to articulate his perspective clearly. "I am not being aggressive. I am simply asking that my property be respected," he stated, his voice echoing slightly in the cold night air. But his words were quickly drowned out by the officers' harsh commands. They moved with a mechanical precision, as if their actions were premeditated and devoid of the empathy that true law enforcement is supposed to embody. In those tense moments, every detail, the flimsy badges, the overly aggressive posture, and the insidious way they disregarded his pleas, told Bart that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The impostor's behavior was a brazen violation of the trust that should exist between citizens and the police. As Bart stood frozen on his property, his mind raced with a mixture of fear and determination. He knew that if this affront to his rights went unchallenged, it could set a dangerous precedent not only for him but for the entire community. With the situation escalating beyond a simple misunderstanding, Bart prepared himself for what came next. The arrival of these fake officers marked the beginning of a night filled with absurdities and conflicts that threatened to upend the order of his once peaceful life. In the unsettling aftermath of the forceful arrival of the supposed police officers, Bart Higgins found himself grappling with a surreal reality. As the two men in uniform continued their aggressive posturing, Bart's instincts nudged him toward a closer inspection. Amid the barrage of commands and threats, a quiet yet persistent thought echoed in his mind: something about these officers just wasn't right. Slowly, Bart shifted his focus from the threatening words to the small, easily overlooked details of their appearance. As the officers closed in, he cast a discreet yet determined glance at their badges. What he saw sent a jolt of realization through him: the badges looked ill-conceived, as though hurriedly made from low-quality materials rather than forged with the dignified precision associated with legitimate law enforcement. The edges were uneven, and the printed insignia appeared faded and poorly executed. This discovery, subtle yet unmistakable, crystallized Bart's growing suspicion: these were not real officers at all. In his mind, the pieces began to fall together. The aggressive tone, the unnerving lack of proper identification, and now the shoddy badges all pointed to a single truth. Bart's heart pounded faster, and the air seemed to thicken with tension. It was in this charged moment, as he subtly scrutinized the officers, that Bart mustered the courage to speak up. "I need to see proper identification," he said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the rising turmoil within him. The response from the impostors was immediate but unconvincing. They exchanged a quick, almost rehearsed glance before one barked a curt remark dismissing his request. Their eyes darted uncomfortably as if avoiding a closer inspection, and their body language betrayed a calculated urgency rather than genuine law enforcement protocol. Bart's demand for identification was not met with the customary professionalism but rather with visible reluctance and evasiveness. This only deepened his conviction that he was dealing with something far more sinister than a mere overzealous police intervention. In that tense exchange, Bart's sense of violation mingled with a keen determination not to be overpowered by the situation. Every word that left his lips carried the weight of a man defending not only his property rights but also his dignity as a citizen. As the impostors fumbled with their badges and attempted to offer vague explanations, Bart's mind raced with a mixture of disbelief and anger. How could individuals, masquerading as protectors, use their fabricated authority to intimidate an innocent man in his own home? The atmosphere grew progressively charged as Bart's observations took root. The once comforting backdrop of his home now bore witness to a scenario that was both absurd and alarming. He realized with increasing certainty that the entire episode was a carefully constructed ruse, designed to exploit both the vulnerabilities of his peaceful evening and the trust typically placed in genuine law enforcement. Bart's insistence on demanding proper identification was more than an act of self-defense, it was a stand for truth in a moment when deception had taken center stage. Even as the impostors shifted their focus back to their aggressive stance, Bart continued to scrutinize them with a determined gaze. Every facet of their behavior, from the shoddy quality of their identification to the rehearsed tone of their responses, painted a picture of deliberate fraud. In the cool night air, the gravity of the situation finally dawned on him. The threat he faced was not merely a misunderstanding, but a calculated attempt to subvert justice and assert control over his personal sanctuary. Realizing that this confrontation had evolved far beyond the bounds of a simple mistaken encounter, Bart steeled himself for the next phase of what was rapidly becoming a nightmarish ordeal. With resolve hardening within him, he prepared to challenge these impostors further, determined that their false authority would not be allowed to trample upon his rights or tarnish the sanctity of his home. In the turbulent moments following Bart's insistence on verifying their identification, the atmosphere around his pool grew even more fraught with tension. The impostors, having been exposed by their shoddy badges and unconvincing explanations, found themselves caught between the mounting evidence of their deceit and Bart's unyielding determination. Their aggressive demeanor faltered under the piercing scrutiny of a homeowner who refused to be intimidated. Realizing that further confrontation could invite unwanted escalation, the two fake officers exchanged hurried glances. Their previously confident posture began to crumble as they recognized that Bart was not going to be placated by empty threats. With a curt nod between them, a silent acknowledgement of their vulnerability, they hastily began to withdraw from the scene. Their departure was unceremonious, the earlier bravado that had accompanied their arrival evaporated as quickly as it had manifested, leaving behind an air of palpable relief tinged with lingering suspicion. Bart watched in a state of mixed emotions as the impostors retreated from his property. Part of him was relieved that the immediate threat had dissipated, but another part was acutely aware that this was only a temporary reprieve in what was rapidly evolving into a deeply unsettling night. The unsettling actions of these impostors had stripped the evening of any remaining semblance of normalcy. What was meant to be a quiet, solitary moment by his pool had transformed into an ordeal that challenged his sense of security and trust in the institutions meant to safeguard it. Almost simultaneously with the impostor's abrupt exit, a furious sound broke the night's fragile calm, the angry voice of Mrs. Eleanor Featherbottom. Standing a short distance away, she glowered in disbelief and indignation at the unfolding chaos. It was evident that she, too, was rattled by the encounter with the fake officers. The fire in her eyes and the harsh tone of her outburst underscored that she felt wronged, not only by Bart's initial request but also by the intrusion of these fraudulent figures into what she believed should have been a routine visit. Mrs. Featherbottom's reaction was a confusing mixture of anger and entitlement. While she had initiated the conflict by making unauthorized use of Bart's pool, the spectacle of fake officers now swirled around the incident like a storm cloud. Her fury was directed at Bart for daring to insist on proper decorum and respect, even as the fake officers had created an atmosphere of lawlessness. She couldn't fathom how Bart could be so unyielding, and her voice rose in protest, echoing across the backyard in a demand for immediate vindication of her actions. Bart, though still seething with a mixture of shock and indignation, maintained a measured composure. He knew that every moment of further escalation could potentially lead to greater consequences. With the fake officers gone and only Mrs. Featherbottom remaining, he faced the challenge of untangling an incident that had grown wildly beyond its original boundaries. He resolved, silently and firmly, to wait for the arrival of real authorities who could restore order and shed light on the deception that had marred his property. In the uneasy silence that followed, the night seemed to hold its breath. Bart was left to navigate the aftermath of these bizarre events, questioning the motivations behind the impostor's presence and grappling with the consequences of Mrs. Featherbottom's obstinate actions. His mind churned with thoughts of justice and fairness, determined that the subversion of his personal space by both fraudulent enforcers and a disruptive neighbor would not go unanswered. The departing footsteps of the impostors had not brought closure but instead only deepened the mystery of a situation that continued to spiral into the unknown. Just as the echoes of the fake officer's departure began to fade into the night, a new sound punctuated the charged atmosphere, a distant wail of sirens heralding the arrival of genuine law enforcement. Bart Higgins, still standing near his pool with a mixture of trepidation and cautious relief, observed as a real police car pulled up onto his driveway. The flashing blue and red lights provided a stark contrast to the disarray that had overtaken his once peaceful property. With a noticeable change in demeanor, the real officers approached with measured steps and a calm assurance that spoke of professional training. Their uniforms were crisp, their badges clearly authenticated, and their eyes carried the weight of responsibility. One officer stepped forward and, in a clear yet gentle tone, introduced himself as part of the local force, immediately establishing an air of credibility that had been sorely lacking moments before. Bart seized this opportunity, explaining the surreal sequence of events that had unfolded since he returned home. In a composed yet impassioned manner, he recounted how he had discovered uninvited guests in his pool, how his rightful demand for privacy had been met not only with dismissive behavior from Mrs. Eleanor Featherbottom but also with the alarming arrival of fake officers. As Bart detailed each moment, the confrontation, the aggressive demands, the shoddy badges, and the intimidating presence of men posing as police, one could sense the depth of his frustration and the resolve to set the record straight. The real officers listened intently, jotting down notes and occasionally exchanging a concerned glance. Their questions were precise, seeking clarification on details that Bart found critical. Were there any distinctive features on these impostors? Did they mention anything about the 911 call? One officer inquired. Each question reassured Bart that he was now in the hands of professionals whose purpose was to restore order and deliver justice. Outside, the neighborhood remained eerily quiet, the earlier chaos now distilled into a moment of reflection. As Bart spoke, the reality of the situation sank in for everyone present. This was not a simple misunderstanding, but a deliberate, orchestrated act of deception that had invaded his home. The fake officer's brazen intrusion and Mrs. Featherbottom's audacious behavior had set off a series of unfortunate events that now required a thorough investigation. The real police assured Bart that they would follow every lead and verify every claim. Their tone was one of earnest commitment to ensuring that the truth was uncovered, and that those responsible for the fraudulent actions would be held accountable. In this measured exchange, Bart found a glimmer of hope. The presence of genuine officers signified that his concerns were being taken seriously, an important step toward reclaiming both his property and his peace of mind. As the officers continued questioning Bart and documenting every detail, the importance of restoring law and order grew increasingly apparent. His once quiet home had become a microcosm of a broader issue, the potential for deception and abuse of power in situations where citizens expected protection and transparency. The real officer's arrival not only validated Bart's account but also sent a clear message to anyone who might try to exploit trust in the community. By the time the interview was drawing to a close, Bart couldn't help but reflect on how drastically a simple evening by the pool had spiraled into a confrontation involving fake enforcers and a disruption of his personal sanctuary. Yet in that reflection was also a sense of resolve. With the arrival of the real police, the hope for a just resolution re-emerged, one that promised accountability, clarity, and the eventual restoration of the quiet dignity that every homeowner deserves. Following the thorough debriefing provided by Bart Higgins to the real police, attention quickly turned toward identifying the source of the initial disturbance. As the officers pored over Bart's detailed account and collected evidence from the scene, it became clear that one individual remained pivotal to the unfolding debacle, Mrs. Eleanor Featherbottom. Within minutes, the officers worked to verify her identity and establish a link between her actions and the chain of events. Surveillance footage from nearby street cameras, corroborated by witness statements from other neighbors, painted a consistent picture, one that implicated Mrs. Featherbottom not only in the unauthorized use of Bart's pool but also in the misleading reports that had sparked the arrival of both fake and real law enforcement. Armed with clear evidence, the officers located Mrs. Featherbottom in a nearby location. When she was brought before them, her demeanor shifted from one of brazen defiance to a more subdued, if still contentious, posture. The officers explained the allegations against her: trespassing on private property, making false 911 reports, and contributing to the chaos that had endangered the sanctity of Bart's home. Despite her initial attempts to dismiss the charges as a minor misunderstanding, the undeniable proof left her no room for evasion. Under the watchful eyes of the arriving officers, Mrs. Featherbottom was formally arrested. The process was conducted with a professional calm that contrasted sharply with the earlier tumult. Bart, though still recovering from the emotional and physical strain of the night's events, felt a bittersweet sense of vindication. The arrest signified not only the enforcement of the law but also an eventual restoration of order to a scene that had spiraled into unprecedented absurdity. For Mrs. Featherbottom, the consequences of her actions were just beginning to take shape. As she was escorted into the police vehicle, her expression was one of defiant resolve, as though she believed that her actions, and the underlying truths she purported to stand for, would be vindicated in time. However, the clear message from the officers was that deception and unlawful behavior would not be tolerated, regardless of personal justification. At that moment, the chaotic night seemed to pause, allowing Bart a brief moment to reflect on the cost of the day's events. With Mrs. Featherbottom's arrest, the scales of justice appeared to tip back toward a semblance of normalcy, a normalcy Bart dearly hoped would return to his life. The quiet, which had long eluded him since the intrusion began to settle in, offering a glimmer of hope that the ordeal might eventually be resolved in his favor. In the final moments of this extraordinary and surreal evening, as the arrest of Mrs. Eleanor Featherbottom was cemented by the diligent efforts of the real police, the true measure of the night's chaos emerged. Even as officers secured her in the back of the patrol car, Mrs. Featherbottom refused to be silenced. With a voice edged in defiance, she leveled threats of legal action against Bart and the local authorities, insisting that her side of the story was justified, even as evidence strongly contradicted her account. Bart, standing by his pool still reeling from the tumult that had invaded his quiet life, listened to her final, bitter words. Her tirade was a piercing epitome of arrogance, a last-ditch attempt to reclaim control over a situation that she had, from the beginning, subverted. While she promised to sue and vowed that the truth would eventually emerge in her favor, the real police remained unfazed. Their calm, measured responses underlined the solidity of the investigation and the stark contrast between her exaggerated claims and the documented reality. As Mrs. Featherbottom was driven away, Bart found himself enveloped in a wave of mixed emotions: disbelief, sorrow, and relief. He was relieved that the ordeal, which had begun with the invasion of his private space and escalated through layers of deceit and impostors, was finally drawing to a close. Yet, the surreal events of that night left an indelible mark on his sense of security and trust in his community. In the quiet that followed, Bart's thoughts turned reflective. He questioned how quickly an ordinary evening could morph into a surreal encounter with fake officers and false accusations. The absurdity of it all was both astounding and deeply disheartening. In the aftermath, Bart resolved to rebuild not only his sense of security but also a belief in the inherent goodness of his neighborhood. The events of the night, particularly Mrs. Featherbottom's brazen defiance, even as evidence stacked against her, served as a powerful reminder of the fragile nature of trust and the importance of standing firm in one's rights. As the real police continued their inquiries and prepared to process the arrest, Bart's quiet reflection underscored a personal determination to reclaim the sanctity of his home. In that final hour, with the threat of further chaos receding into the background, Bart Higgins stood as a solitary figure, an ordinary man who had found himself thrust into an extraordinary situation. And while the lingering echoes of threats and false accusations would take time to fade away, he remained resolute in his belief that truth and justice, however delayed, would ultimately prevail.